My name is Johnny, I'm 42, and for 20 golden years, I believed the ultimate lie, that my marriage to Clara was built on pure, unbreakable trust. But last Tuesday in our quiet kitchen, Clara carelessly left her tablet unlocked on the counter, a tiny mistake that triggered an irreversible nightmare. What did I actually discover? A secret offshore account under her name, hidden camera feeds from our own bedroom, and a detailed blueprint of my own planned, accidental, demise. Within 48 chaotic hours, my entire existence collapsed into a desperate race for survival. And there she sat this morning, humming softly while spreading butter on her toast, completely oblivious that the countdown to her absolute ruin had already begun. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting long, cold shadows across the hardwood floor where Arthur had writhed in pain only hours before. The house was utterly empty. Clara had packed a single suitcase in the dead of night, her hands shaking as she threw random garments inside, before fleeing to her sister's house in a panic. She left behind the wreckage of our 20-year marriage, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the suffocating weight of what we had become. Yet, as I stood in the center of the living room, the silence that should have broken me felt different. It was deafening, yes, but beneath the grief, a strange, cold sensation began to take root. For the first time in months, I felt a genuine sense of control. I was no longer the unsuspecting husband playing a fool's game. I was the architect of my own grim reality. I spent the entire day systematically erasing the digital fortress I had constructed. I climbed the step stool to the smoke detector in our bedroom, twisting it open to retrieve the tiny, high-resolution lens that had captured her betrayal. I pulled the hidden microphones from her favorite purses left in the closet, the chargers from the living room outlets, and the audio bugs from beneath the kitchen counter. One by one, I lined them up on the dining table, 6 cameras and 5 recorders that had documented the death of my happiness. I connected each device to my laptop, ensuring every single byte of footage and audio was uploaded to a secure, triple-encrypted cloud server hosted offshore. Once the transfer was complete, I took a heavy hammer from my toolbox and smashed the physical hardware into unrecognizable plastic and silicon dust. I swept the remains into a black trash bag, drove to a dumpster miles away from our neighborhood, and watched them disappear. By Monday afternoon, I had retained a ruthless family law attorney who specialized in high-stakes divorces. On Wednesday morning, he personally delivered the divorce papers to Clara at her sister's home. There was no negotiation, no back and forth, and no division of assets that favored her. The terms were simple and brutal: I kept the house, the savings, and she waived any right to alimony. She signed the documents without a single revision, her signature trembling on the dotted line. She was too terrified of the alternative. She knew that a single click of my mouse would release the high-definition footage of her and Arthur to her firm's managing partners, her colleagues, her daughter, and Arthur's young, vindictive wife. The fear of social and professional ruin had stripped away any desire she had to fight. She surrendered completely, signing away 2 decades of her life in a matter of minutes. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on Friday afternoon. I sat at my desk at the construction firm, staring at the screen of my phone. At exactly 4 o'clock, a notification popped up from my banking application. A wire transfer originating from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands had cleared. The balance in my checking account had increased by exactly $1 million. I stared at the long row of zeros, feeling a profound, hollow emptiness wash over me. It was the price Arthur had paid to buy my silence, a fortune to protect his prestigious career and his fragile marriage. But as I looked at the digital numbers on the screen, there was no joy, no sense of triumph. The money was merely a bitter, cold compensation for the absolute destruction of my heart. I had won the battle, but the prize was a lifetime of solitude and a ghost of the woman I had loved more than life itself. The weekend that followed the wire transfer was the quietest of my life. I sat in the living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes I had no desire to pack, watching the rain beat against the glass of the bay window. My phone lay on the coffee table, a constant source of agitation. It buzzed incessantly, the screen lighting up with Clara's name over and over again. She called in the morning, during the quiet hours of the afternoon, and late into the night when the darkness made the silence in the house feel even heavier. She sent long, desperate text messages that I deleted without reading. I wanted to believe I was strong enough to ignore her forever, but the human heart is a fragile, stubborn thing. By Sunday evening, after her 12th consecutive call of the day, I stared at the vibrating device and felt a sudden, inexplicable urge. I did not want to forgive her, and I certainly did not want to take her back, but I needed to hear her voice one last time. I needed to hear the reality of her ruin to match the ruin she had brought upon me. I swiped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear, saying nothing. For a moment, there was only the sound of ragged, wet breathing on the other end of the line. "Johnny, oh my God, Johnny, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking with an intensity of grief I had never heard from her before. I closed my eyes, the sound of her weeping pulling at a phantom limb of affection I thought I had already severed. "Please do not hang up," she begged, her words rushing out in a desperate, chaotic torrent. "I made a terrible mistake, Johnny. A horrible, disgusting mistake. I was lost, and I was so flattered by his attention and the wealth, but it was always you. It was only ever you that I loved. Please, I am begging you, do not throw away 20 years of marriage over this. We can fix this. We can go to therapy, we can leave this city, we can start over anywhere you want. Just please do not leave me like this." I listened to her cries, waiting for the familiar surge of love or pity to wash over me, but there was nothing. Inside my chest, there was only a profound, empty coldness, like a hearth whose ashes had long since gone gray. The woman weeping on the phone was a stranger to me, a ghost inhabiting the shell of the wife I had cherished. "You did not just sleep with him, Clara," I said, my voice quiet and steady, cutting through her hysterics like a scalpel. If it had just been a physical slip, a momentary lapse in judgment, maybe we could have talked. But it was so much more than that. I watched the tapes, Clara. I heard the audio. You stood by and let him mock my life, my hard work, and my career. You laughed when he called me an idiot. You sat in my bed and told him that he satisfied you in ways I never could. You gave him the intimacy, the secrets, and the very words of love that belonged only to us. You took the sacred space we built over 20 years and you handed it to a man who viewed you as nothing more than a trophy. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by a fresh wave of quiet, defeated sobbing. "Johnny, I did not mean it," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I was just playing a part. I was stupid." "It does not matter what you meant," I replied, staring at the empty wall where our wedding portrait used to hang. "The damage is done. You killed everything I ever felt for you, and there is absolutely nothing left to save." Without waiting for her to respond, I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. My hand was steady as I went into her contact settings, tapped the screen, and blocked her number permanently. I did the same on my social media accounts, cutting the final digital threads that connected us. I took a deep breath, feeling a sudden, strange lightness in my chest. I truly believed in that moment that the worst of the storm had passed. I had the house, I had $1 million in the bank, and I had my dignity intact. I believed I had successfully navigated the betrayal, outmaneuvered her wealthy lover, and secured a bright, independent future for myself. I was free, and I was ready to begin again, completely unaware of the dark waters that were already rising to drag me under. Chapter 3. For exactly 14 days, I lived in a state of quiet, triumphant delusion. I woke up early each morning, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and sat on the back deck of the house that was now entirely mine, watching the autumn leaves drift slowly onto the lawn. The $1 million sat in my bank account like an impenetrable shield, a digital monument to my survival and my cleverness. At work, I threw myself into my projects with a renewed, aggressive focus, guiding my construction teams with a clarity I had not possessed in months. The heavy, suffocating fog of suspicion and grief had lifted, replaced by the cold, hard satisfaction of a man who had faced his betrayers, broken them, and walked away with his pockets full and his dignity intact. I believed I had beaten the system. I believed that my meticulous planning had insulated me from any possible consequences, and that Arthur and Clara were far too terrified of public ruin to ever dare strike back. I was completely, utterly wrong. It was a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after Clara had signed the divorce papers, when the illusion shattered. I was sitting at my desk in the construction firm, reviewing a set of blueprints for a new commercial development downtown, when the glass door to the main office opened. 2 men in dark, conservative suits walked in, their faces devoid of expression as they bypassed the receptionist and walked straight toward my glass-walled office. I watched them approach, a sudden, cold prickle of unease rising along the back of my neck. They did not look like clients, and they certainly did not look like subcontractors. When they stepped into my office, the older of the two pulled a leather wallet from his breast pocket, revealing a gold badge. "Are you John Sterling?" the older man asked, his voice flat and professional. "I am," I replied, slowly setting down my drafting pen. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" "I am Detective Miller, and this is Detective Vance, with the state police," he said. "We have a warrant for your arrest. I need you to stand up, turn around, and place your hands behind your back." The words did not make sense. I stared at him, my mind scrambling to find a logical explanation. An arrest warrant? For what? "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice cracking slightly as I stood up. "I am a project manager here. I have lived in this town for 20 years. "Stand up and turn around, Mr. Sterling," Detective Vance repeated, his hand resting casually near his hip. Before I could protest further, Vance stepped behind me. He grabbed my wrists, pulling them behind my back with a practiced, brutal efficiency. The cold, heavy metal of the handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists, the ratchets biting into my skin with a sudden, sharp pain that made the reality of the situation crash down upon me. The quiet office erupted into a flurry of whispered conversations. I was led out of my glass office, down the main corridor, and past the desks of my colleagues, who stared at me with a mixture of shock, pity, and disgust. I could feel their eyes burning into me as we walked out into the bright afternoon sun, where a marked police cruiser was parked directly in front of the building, its blue lights silently reflecting against the glass facade. I was pushed into the cramped, plastic-smelling back seat, the door slamming shut with a heavy, final thud that seemed to seal my fate. The ride to the state police barracks was conducted in absolute silence. I stared out the window at the familiar streets of my town, watching the ordinary lives of strangers pass by while my own world collapsed in the back of a police car. When we arrived, I was processed, fingerprinted, and photographed, the black ink on my fingertips feeling like a permanent stain of guilt. I was then led into a small, windowless interrogation room with a metal table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. The air was cold and smelled of industrial disinfectant and stale coffee. I sat alone for what felt like hours, the handcuffs finally removed but my hands still shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. Finally, the door opened, and my attorney, Frank Miller, walked in. He was a seasoned, expensive defense lawyer whom I had hired to handle the division of assets during the divorce, but the look on his face now was entirely different from the confident, reassuring grin he had worn in his office. He looked tired, his eyes heavy and his brow furrowed as he set a thick manila folder onto the metal table. "Frank, what the hell is going on?" I demanded, leaning forward. "How did this happen? I told you everything was handled. Arthur wired the money, Clara signed the papers. It was over." Frank let out a long, slow sigh, pulling out the metal chair opposite me and sitting down. He rubbed his temples before looking me in the eyes. "Johnny, you are in incredibly deep trouble. You thought you were playing chess, but you did not bother to check the rules of the board. Arthur Pendleton did not just roll over and accept your terms. The moment he recovered from that attack, he went to one of the most powerful criminal defense firms in the state. They did not care about the affair, Johnny. They did not care about the moral betrayal. They cared about the law, and you handed them a loaded gun with your name written on the bullets. I do not understand, I stammered. I have the recordings. I have the proof of what they did. It does not matter, Frank said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Connecticut is a strict two-party consent state when it comes to wiretapping and recording. Under state law, it is a Class D felony to record any oral communication or video in a private space without the consent of every single person being recorded. Every camera you put in your bedroom, every microphone you hid in her purse, every audio bug in her car, each one of those is a separate felony charge. You recorded them in your own home, yes, but Clara had a legal expectation of privacy in her own residence. You violated that. But she was cheating on me, I argued, my voice rising in desperation. In my own bed. With her boss. The law does not care about infidelity, Johnny, Frank said coldly. The family courts might care a little, but the criminal justice system does not. And that is not even the worst of it. Arthur's legal team hired an elite digital forensics firm. They tracked the IP addresses used to access the surveillance stream back to your personal cell phone and your work laptop. They have a complete digital paper trail showing that you installed the software, purchased the cameras, and monitored the feed. And then, you made the fatal mistake. You demanded $1 million in exchange for not releasing those videos. That was a settlement, I insisted, my hands clenching into fists. A compensation for what he did to my marriage. No, Frank corrected me, leaning in close. Under Connecticut general statutes, that is the textbook definition of first-degree larceny by extortion. You threatened to expose private, damaging material to destroy his reputation and his career unless he paid you a massive sum of money. Larceny by extortion is a Class B felony, Johnny. It carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in state prison, and because of the amount of money involved, the prosecutor is looking to make an example out of you. They have the wire transfer records, they have the digital footprint of the website you threatened to launch, and they have Arthur's sworn statement. They have you dead to rights. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. The room seemed to spin, the gray concrete walls closing in on me until I could barely breathe. 10 years. 10 years in a state penitentiary, surrounded by violent criminals, my career ruined, my life over, all because I wanted to punish the man who had stolen my wife. What do we do? I whispered, the anger completely draining from my voice, leaving only a hollow, pathetic fear. There has to be a way out. Frank opened the manila folder, revealing a stack of legal documents. Arthur's lawyers and the state prosecutor have already laid out their terms. They know a trial would be highly publicized and ugly, which is the only leverage we have. They want to avoid a public circus just as much as we do, but they are holding all the cards. They are offering a plea agreement, but the terms are devastating. Tell me, I said, bracing myself. First, you must immediately return the entire $1 million to Arthur's offshore account, Frank said, reading from the document. Second, Clara's attorneys have filed a civil suit against you for invasion of privacy and intentional infliction of emotional distress. To get her to drop the charges and agree to the plea deal, you must sign over the deed to the house and forfeit your entire personal savings to her. Every single dollar you earned over 20 years of hard work will go to her as a civil settlement. I stared at him in disbelief. My house. My savings. Everything. I would be left with nothing. And the criminal charges, I asked, my voice trembling. If you agree to the financial terms, the prosecutor will allow you to plead guilty to a single count of unauthorized recording, a Class D felony, Frank explained. You will avoid prison time, but you will have a permanent felony record. You will be on probation for 5 years, and you will have to complete 200 hours of community service. If you refuse, we go to trial, and I promise you, Johnny, you will lose. You will spend the next decade of your life behind bars, and they will still take everything you own in civil court. I sat in the silence of the interrogation room, the weight of my choices crushing me into insignificance. I had thought I was the victor. I had thought my anger was a righteous force that would protect me, but the law was a cold, unfeeling machine that cared nothing for my broken heart. It only cared about the rules I had broken in my pursuit of vengeance. I looked at the pen Frank held out to me, my hand shaking so violently I could barely grip it. With a heavy, broken heart, I signed the documents, surrendering my home, my savings, my fortune, and my freedom. 1 year later, the rain fell in a steady, freezing drizzle, washing over the cracked asphalt of the bus stop where I stood. I was dressed in a cheap, faded polyester security guard uniform, my boots worn through at the soles, letting the cold water seep into my socks. My shift at the commercial warehouse had ended at 4 o'clock in the morning, and my body ached with a deep, permanent exhaustion that sleep could no longer cure. My career in construction was over. No firm would hire a project manager with a felony record for wiretapping and extortion. I lived in a cramped, damp studio apartment on the industrial edge of the city, surviving on minimum wage and counting pennies just to buy groceries. As I stood under the rusted metal awning of the bus stop, shivering in the damp air, the quiet of the morning was broken by the low, powerful rumble of a high-performance engine. A sleek, brand-new silver sports car pulled up to the red light directly in front of me, its headlights cutting through the gray mist. I looked at the vehicle, a machine that cost more than I would make in a decade of security shifts. The driver's side window was tinted, but as the car came to a stop, the glass rolled down a few inches to clear the condensation. I froze. Behind the wheel sat Arthur Pendleton, looking as immaculate and arrogant as he ever had, his expensive watch catching the light of the street lamp. He did not look like a man who had suffered a single consequence for his actions. In the passenger seat beside him sat Clara. Her hair was styled perfectly, a beautiful designer scarf wrapped around her neck, her face bright with laughter as she leaned over to whisper something in his ear. She looked radiant, youthful, and completely untouched by the tragedy that had destroyed my existence. As she laughed, her eyes drifted toward the bus stop, her gaze locking onto me. For a fraction of a second, her smile faltered. She looked at my faded uniform, my wet hair, and the plastic bag of cheap groceries in my hand. There was no remorse in her eyes, no guilt, and no sorrow for the 20 years of marriage she had discarded like trash. There was only a cold, distant pity, the kind of look one might give to a stray dog shivering in an alley. She turned back to Arthur, placing her hand on his knee as he stepped on the gas. The sports car roared away into the morning mist, splashing a wave of dirty, stagnant rainwater over my boots. I stood alone in the cold, watching their tail lights disappear into the dark, realizing with a bitter, bleeding certainty that the world does not reward the righteous, and that some betrayals are never punished. The 2 weeks that followed Clara's departure were characterized by a strange, hollow quiet that I mistook for peace. I spent my days at the construction firm, buried under blueprints, scheduling conflicts, and concrete delivery timelines for our largest commercial project of the year. The work was a welcome distraction, a physical anchor that kept my mind from drifting back to the empty house, the smashed cameras, and the memory of my wife in another man's arms. Every morning, I would log into my online banking portal just to look at the balance. $1 million. The numbers were a cold, digital testament to my victory. I had outsmarted them. I had taken the man who mocked my career and forced him to pay for his arrogance, and I had cut the cancer of Clara's betrayal out of my life with surgical precision. I felt invincible, wrapped in an armor of righteous anger and financial security, completely blind to the storm gathering just beyond the horizon. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon, exactly 14 days after the divorce papers had been signed, when the trap finally sprung. The autumn wind was rattling the glass panes of my office, and the scent of rain and wet asphalt drifted in from the open window. I was leaning over a large mahogany table, cross-referencing a structural engineering report with a set of foundation layouts, when the ambient noise of the office suddenly died. The constant hum of ringing phones, clacking keyboards, and hushed conversations evaporated, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. I raised my head, squinting through the glass partition of my office toward the reception area. 2 men had just entered. They did not wear the casual flannel or muddy boots of our subcontractors, nor did they wear the sharp, expensive suits of our commercial clients. They wore dark, heavy overcoats, their faces set in grim, unreadable expressions that immediately made the hair on my arms stand up. The older of the two, a man with graying hair and a hard, weathered jawline, spoke briefly to the receptionist, who pointed a trembling finger toward my door. I stood up slowly, my heart taking a sudden, violent leap in my chest as they walked directly toward me, their boots clicking softly on the thin office carpet. When they stepped into my office, the older man closed the door behind them, shutting out the staring eyes of my colleagues. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gold shield that caught the fluorescent light. "I am Detective Miller, and this is Detective Vance, with the state police," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth or emotion. "Are you John Sterling?" "I am," I replied, my voice sounding tight, my throat suddenly dry as desert sand. "Is there a problem with one of our job sites?" "No, Mr. Sterling," Detective Miller said, slipping the badge back into his coat. "We have a warrant for your arrest. I need you to step away from the desk, turn around, and place your hands behind your back." The words bounced off my brain, refusing to sink in. Arrest. The word was foreign, ridiculous, a mistake meant for someone else. "For what?" I asked, forcing a nervous chuckle that died instantly in the cold atmosphere of the room. "I am a project manager. I have lived in this county for 20 years. There must be some kind of misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," Detective Vance said, stepping around the table to stand beside me. He was younger, broader, with a physical presence that made my small office feel suffocatingly tight. "Turn around, sir. Do not make this difficult." Before I could process the humiliation, Vance grabbed my right arm, twisting it behind my back with a firm, practiced grip. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around my wrist, followed immediately by the left. The ratchets bit into my skin, a sharp, physical pain that finally shattered my denial. I was led out of my office, my head bowed as we walked through the bullpen. Every single one of my coworkers was staring. Some looked away in embarrassment, while others watched with a morbid, wide-eyed curiosity. I saw my boss, Mr. Henderson, standing by the water cooler, his face a mask of disappointment and shock. I wanted to scream, to explain that I was the victim, that I was the one who had been betrayed, but the words caught in my throat. I was led out into the bright, mocking sunlight and pushed into the hard plastic back seat of a marked police cruiser, the door slamming shut with a heavy, metallic finality that sounded like the closing of a tomb. The drive to the state police barracks was an agonizing blur of gray highway and flashing blue lights. I stared at the wire mesh partition separating me from the detectives, my mind racing through every possible scenario. How had they found out? Had Clara gone to the police? Had Arthur broken? I had the videos. I had the leverage. Surely they knew that if they touched me, their lives would be ruined. When we arrived at the barracks, the reality of my situation became even more terrifying. I was processed like a common criminal. My belt, shoelaces, and wallet were confiscated. My fingers were pressed into a cold ink pad, leaving black, greasy marks on a white card. I was forced to stand against a height chart while a camera flashed, capturing the hollow, terrified look in my eyes. Finally, I was led to a small, windowless interrogation room. A single metal table and 2 plastic chairs were bolted to the concrete floor. The air was freezing, smelling of industrial bleach and old sweat. I sat there for 3 hours, the handcuffs finally removed but my hands shaking so violently I had to tuck them between my knees to keep them still. The heavy steel door finally clicked open, and my attorney, Frank Miller, walked in. He was a high-priced defense lawyer I had hired to handle the divorce, a man who usually carried himself with an air of absolute confidence. But as he sat down across from me, his face was pale, his eyes heavy behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He placed a thick, blue folder on the table and rubbed his face with both hands, letting out a long, ragged sigh. "Frank, what is this?" I pleaded, leaning forward until my chest pressed against the cold metal of the table. "Tell me this is a mistake. I did everything right. Arthur paid the money. Clara signed the papers. They cannot do this." "Johnny," Frank said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "You did not do everything right. In fact, you did everything as wrong as you possibly could. Arthur Pendleton did not roll over. The moment he left your house, he did not go to a doctor to nurse his wounds. He went straight to the senior partners of his law firm, and by the next morning, they had hired a team of elite private forensic investigators and criminal defense experts. They did not care about the affair, Johnny. In the eyes of the criminal law, the affair is completely irrelevant. They cared about what you did to catch them." "What I did," I stammered. "I recorded them in my own house. In my own bed." "It does not matter whose house it was," Frank said, tapping the blue folder with his pen. "Connecticut is a strict two-party consent state. Under state law, it is a Class D felony to record any wire, oral, or electronic communication without the consent of all parties involved. Clara lived in that house. She had a legal expectation of privacy in her own bedroom, regardless of whether she was betraying your marriage. Every single camera you installed, every microphone you hid in her purses, every bug you placed in her car, each one of those is a separate, distinct felony charge. But they were committing a crime against my marriage," I argued, my voice rising in desperation. "He was sleeping with my wife." "Infidelity is not a crime, Johnny," Frank said coldly. "Wiretapping is. And it gets much worse. Arthur's forensic team did not just find the cameras. They obtained a court order to subpoena the logs of the surveillance application you used. They tracked the digital footprint, the IP addresses, and the data packets back to your personal cell phone and your office computer. They have a complete, unbroken chain of digital evidence showing that you purchased the equipment, installed it, and actively monitored the feed. They have the exact times you logged in, the duration of your sessions, and the IP addresses of the hotels you stayed at while you watched them." I sat back, the air rushing out of my lungs as if I had been struck in the chest. The brilliant plan, the foolproof surveillance web I had spent weeks designing, was not a shield. It was a net, and I had woven it around my own neck. "And then," Frank continued, his eyes locking onto mine with a grim intensity, "you committed the ultimate blunder. You demanded $1 million in exchange for not releasing those recordings. You put the threat in writing, you gave them a deadline, and you accepted the transfer. Under state law, that is not a settlement. That is first-degree larceny by extortion. It is a Class B felony, Johnny. It carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in state prison. The prosecutor is not looking to be lenient. Arthur is a powerful man with deep political connections in this state, and his lawyers are pushing for the absolute maximum. They want to destroy you, and you have given them every single tool they need to do it." The cold concrete walls of the interrogation room seemed to close in on me, suffocating me in the dim light. 10 years. 10 years in a cell, my life stripped away, my career ended, my name dragged through the mud, while the man who had ruined my marriage walked free. The room began to spin, and a sick, familiar nausea rose in my throat. I looked at Frank, my eyes pleading for a miracle, but his face remained cast in stone. The trap was absolute, and there was no way out. The silence that followed Frank Miller's words was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. I sat frozen in the metal chair, staring at the scarred surface of the interrogation table, my mind desperately trying to claw its way out of the nightmare that had suddenly become my reality. The faint, high-pitched buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead sounded like a distant alarm, warning me of an impending collapse that I was powerless to stop. Across from me, Frank looked older, his face lined with a deep, professional exhaustion that offered no comfort. He slowly turned the pages in the blue folder, each rustle of paper sounding like a dry leaf scraping against a tombstone. I looked at my hands, still stained with the faint black residue of the fingerprint ink. Only 14 days ago, I had believed myself to be a master strategist. I had stood in my bedroom, holding $1 million in a digital account, convinced that I had successfully extracted a poetic, financial justice from the man who had shattered my 20-year marriage. I had believed that the law would naturally side with the victim, that my quiet, meticulous gathering of evidence was a justified response to an unspeakable betrayal. But as I sat in the cold, sterile room of the state police barracks, the harsh truth began to sink in. The legal system was not a moral arbiter. It did not care about the agony of a husband watching his wife transform herself for another man. It did not care about the whispered words of love stolen in my own bed, or the mocking laughter that had cut me to the bone. The law was a cold, unfeeling machine of technicalities, statutes, and definitions, and I had walked directly into its gears. Frank leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone that demanded my absolute attention. "Johnny, you need to understand the gravity of what we are facing here," he began, his eyes locking onto mine. "First-degree larceny by extortion is not a charge the state takes lightly. Because the amount of money you demanded and received was exactly $1 million, you have crossed the threshold into the most severe category of financial crimes. In the state of Connecticut, this is a Class B felony. If we go to trial and a jury sees the written threats you sent, the deadline you imposed, and the wire transfer confirmation from Arthur's offshore account, they will convict you. There is no defense of justification for extortion. You cannot argue that you took the money because he slept with your wife. The mandatory minimum sentence for this charge is 10 years in a state penitentiary, and the maximum is 20 years. You would serve that time in a maximum security facility alongside violent offenders. Your life, as you know it, would be permanently over." 10 years, I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. My voice was barely a croak, stripped of all the anger and defiance that had fueled me for the past month. 10 years in a concrete cell. I thought of my daughter, Sarah, who was currently in college, believing her parents were simply going through a quiet, amicable divorce. I thought of my career, the 20 years of hard work I had invested in the construction firm, building a reputation as an honest, dependable man. All of it was about to be erased, replaced by a prison identification number and an orange jumpsuit. "Is there no way to fight the wiretapping charges?" I asked, my hands clenching into tight, white-knuckled fists. "It was my house, Frank. I paid the mortgage. I bought the smoke detectors. How can it be a felony to record what happens under my own roof?" Frank shook his head, a look of pity softening his stern expression. "It does not matter who pays the mortgage, Johnny. The law protects the expectation of privacy of any occupant in their place of residence. Clara lived there. She had a key, her name was on the deed, and she slept there every night. By installing hidden cameras in the bedroom and the bathroom, and by placing audio bugs in her personal handbags and her car, you committed multiple counts of unauthorized recording. Each of those is a Class D felony, carrying up to 5 years of prison time. Arthur's legal team has presented the state prosecutor with an undeniable, airtight case. Their digital forensics team was incredibly thorough. They have the IP logs showing every time you accessed the surveillance application from your phone, even matching the coordinates to the hotels you stayed at during your business trips. They have the serial numbers of the devices you purchased. They have everything. If we fight this, we are marching into a slaughterhouse." I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the high, barred window of the interrogation room. Through the thick glass, I could see the gray, overcast sky, a dull and lifeless canopy that seemed to mimic the sudden emptiness in my soul. I remembered the night I had stood in the doorway of my bedroom, holding the non-lethal pepper pistol, watching Clara scramble to cover herself while Arthur writhed on the floor in agony. I had felt so powerful then. I had felt like an avenging angel, delivering a long-overdue reckoning to the arrogant man who had belittled my career and stolen my wife. But it had all been an illusion, a trap designed to make me feel secure while they quietly built a legal fortress around me. "So, what is the prosecutor offering?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of any hope. Frank sighed, opening the document in front of him and pointing to a series of paragraphs detailed in dense, legal prose. They are offering a plea agreement, but it is incredibly punitive. They know they have you, but they also know that a trial would expose Arthur's affair and create a massive scandal for his law firm. To avoid that public circus, they are willing to let you plead guilty to a single count of unauthorized recording, which is a Class D felony. The prosecutor will recommend a suspended sentence with 5 years of probation, meaning you will not have to serve a single day in prison. I felt a sudden, brief wave of relief wash over me, but Frank's expression did not change. He held up a finger, stopping me before I could speak. "Do not celebrate yet, Johnny. That is only the criminal portion of the agreement. To secure this plea, and to ensure that Clara and Arthur do not pursue separate civil actions that would put you in prison regardless, you must agree to their financial terms. And they are designed to strip you of absolutely everything." My heart sank back into the cold depths of my chest. "What are the terms?" I asked. "First, you must immediately return the entire $1 million to Arthur's offshore account," Frank said, his voice steady as he delivered the blow. "The wire transfer must be initiated within 24 hours of signing this agreement. You cannot keep a single penny of that money. Second, Clara's attorneys have filed a massive civil lawsuit against you for invasion of privacy, loss of consortium, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. As a settlement to dismiss those charges with prejudice, you must sign over the entire equity of your suburban home to Clara. You must vacate the premises within 7 days, leaving behind all furniture and appliances. Furthermore, you must forfeit your entire personal savings and retirement accounts to her. Every dollar you have saved over the last 20 years, every investment, every cent of your hard-earned money, will be transferred to Clara's sole account." I stared at him, my jaw dropping in absolute shock. My savings. My house. The home I had spent 2 decades maintaining, the yard I had mowed, the roof I had repaired with my own hands. Everything I had built, everything I had earned through years of sweat and labor at the construction firm, was being handed over to the woman who had betrayed me. She would get the house, the money, and her freedom, while I would be left with nothing but a felony record and a cardboard box of clothes. "That is not a settlement," I choked out, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and grief. "That is robbery. She cheated on me. She ruined our family. She lied to my face for months, and now she gets to keep everything I worked for. How is that justice? How can the law allow this?" "Justice has nothing to do with this room, Johnny," Frank said softly, his eyes filled with a grim, realistic truth. "This is about survival. If you do not sign this agreement, the state prosecutor will indict you on the extortion charge by tomorrow morning. Your bail will be set at an amount you cannot afford, and you will wait for your trial in a county jail. When you lose, and you will lose, you will go to prison for 10 years. While you are locked away, Clara's civil lawyers will still take your house and your savings through default judgments. You will emerge in a decade with absolutely nothing, your youth gone, your career destroyed, and your freedom permanently compromised. If you sign this paper, you lose your wealth, yes. You lose your home. But you keep your freedom. You walk out of that door today, and you do not go to prison." I buried my face in my hands, the tears finally breaking through my defenses. I sobbed silently, my shoulders shaking as the sheer weight of my defeat crushed the last remnants of my pride. I had wanted to hurt them. I had wanted to make them feel a fraction of the agony I had felt when I watched that surveillance feed. But in my haste for vengeance, I had destroyed myself. I had handed them the very weapons they used to strip me of my life, my home, and my future. The image of Clara laughing in the kitchen, of Arthur smirking at me at the company dinner, flashed through my mind, a cruel and mocking reminder of how completely I had failed. Frank placed a heavy, black ink pen on the table, sliding it toward my trembling hands. The paper was laid out before me, the lines for my signature looking like a final, binding contract of surrender. "Take your time, Johnny," Frank said quietly. "But we need to make a decision. The prosecutor is waiting in the next room, and his patience is running thin. I stared at the pen, the black plastic casing gleaming under the harsh lights. My mind replayed the last 20 years, the quiet Sunday mornings, the laughter of our daughter, the warmth of the home we had built. It was all gone, reduced to a set of legal terms and a financial forfeiture. I had no choice. I had no leverage, no power, and no way out of the trap I had built for myself. With a hand that shook so violently I could barely control it, I picked up the pen. I pressed the tip to the paper and signed my name, writing away my home, my savings, my career, and my fortune in 3 quick, desperate strokes of ink. When I finished, I dropped the pen onto the table, where it rolled a few inches before coming to a stop. I felt completely hollow, as if my entire identity had been vacuumed out of my body, leaving only an empty, aching shell. "You did the right thing, Johnny," Frank said, gathering the papers and slipping them back into the blue folder. "You survived. That is what matters." I did not feel like a survivor. I felt like a ghost, a man who had died in that interrogation room and was now forced to wander the earth without a purpose. An hour later, the handcuffs were gone, and the heavy steel doors of the police barracks opened, releasing me into the cool, damp evening air. The sun had already set, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple that offered no light. I walked down the concrete steps of the station, my footsteps echoing in the quiet night. I had no car, my keys having been confiscated as part of the agreement, and my wallet contained only a few crumpled bills and a single credit card that would soon be cancelled. I stood on the sidewalk, watching the passing headlights of ordinary people driving home to their families, to their warm houses, and to their secure lives. I had none of those things anymore. I was a felon, a man without a home, without a savings account, and without a future. I pulled my jacket tight against the gathering chill, took a deep breath of the damp air, and began the long, lonely walk into the dark, completely unaware of how much further I had yet to fall. The passage of 12 months did nothing to soften the sharp, jagged edges of my new reality. 365 days had crawled by in a blur of gray concrete, cold rain, and absolute isolation, each morning starting exactly the same way in my cramped studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The room smelled permanently of damp plaster and cheap radiator steam, a far cry from the comforting aroma of cinnamon and roasted chicken that used to fill my suburban home on Sunday afternoons. My current home consisted of a single twin bed with a sagging mattress, a dented metal dresser, and a small laminate table where I ate my solitary meals. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the constant, low-frequency rumble of the highway and the muffled arguments of my neighbors. It was a prison of my own making, a physical manifestation of the absolute ruin I had brought upon myself in my desperate, blind pursuit of vengeance. I had gone from a respected project manager making over $200,000 a year to a night security guard earning barely above minimum wage. The felony conviction on my record acted like a brand, a permanent mark of Cain that warned every reputable employer away from me. During the first few months of my job search, I had tried to explain the context of my charges to hiring managers, to tell them about the betrayal of my 20-year marriage and the trap that had been set for me, but their eyes would inevitably glaze over with a cold, professional detachment. To them, I was not a victim of infidelity, I was a dangerous, unstable felon convicted of unauthorized wiretapping and extortion. I was a liability. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain. I accepted the low-wage night shift at a sprawling, desolate shipping warehouse near the docks, where the only requirement for employment was a clean drug test and a willingness to stand in the freezing cold for 12 hours at a time. The loss of my career was a heavy blow, but it was nothing compared to the complete severing of my family. The legal battle and the subsequent civil settlement had been handled with a quiet, ruthless efficiency by Arthur's team of high-priced lawyers, who ensured that the narrative presented to the world was one of my complete and utter instability. Clara's sister and her parents had been told that I was a violent, obsessive stalker who had held Clara hostage in her own home with hidden cameras and microphones. My own daughter, Sarah, caught in the middle of a war she did not understand, had eventually stopped returning my calls. The last time we spoke, her voice had been cold, distant, and filled with a quiet disappointment that cut deeper than any physical wound. She told me she needed space, that she could not look at me the same way after learning about the cameras in the bedroom. I had tried to tell her the truth, to explain that her mother had been sleeping with another man in the very bed I had paid for, but Sarah had simply hung up. The silence that followed that call had never been broken. My routine was a mindless, repetitive loop designed to keep me from thinking too deeply about what I had lost. I would wake up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, brew a pot of cheap, bitter coffee, and stare out the single window of my apartment at the gray, brick facade of the warehouse across the alley. At 6 o'clock, I would pull on my cheap polyester security uniform, a scratchy, ill-fitting garment that smelled faintly of the industrial detergent used by the industrial laundry service. I would walk 2 miles to the shipping terminal, my boots clicking rhythmically against the cracked asphalt of the sidewalks, my head bowed against the biting autumn wind. The night shift was a test of endurance. From 8 o'clock in the evening until 8 o'clock the following morning, I walked the perimeter of the chain-link fence, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as I checked the locks on the shipping containers and monitored the silent, empty loading docks. The cold off the river was relentless, seeping through the thin soles of my boots and stiffening my joints until every step was an exercise in pain. I had plenty of time to think during those long, dark hours. I would replay the past 20 years of my life, searching for the exact moment the foundation of my marriage had begun to rot. I would remember the warmth of Clara's body next to mine, the soft, breathless way she used to whisper her love for me in the dark, and I would try to reconcile those memories with the image of her in the red silk lingerie, inviting another man into our home. The two versions of my wife could not coexist in my mind, leaving me in a state of perpetual, agonizing confusion. On a freezing, wet Tuesday morning in November, my shift finally ended. The rain had been falling in a steady, icy drizzle for hours, turning the streets into slick, black mirrors that reflected the pale glow of the street lamps. My body ached with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion as I clocked out and walked toward the bus stop on the corner of Industrial Parkway and Main Street. I stood under the rusted metal awning of the shelter, shivering in the damp air, holding a thin plastic grocery bag that contained my sweat-stained uniform shirt and a half-eaten sandwich. The cold water was slowly dripping from the edge of the roof, splashing onto the pavement near my worn leather boots. The street was empty, save for the occasional delivery truck rumbling past in the gray, early morning light. I checked my watch, it was 5:15. The bus was not scheduled to arrive for another 20 minutes. I leaned my head against the cold metal support beam of the shelter, closing my eyes and wishing for a sleep that did not involve nightmares of courtrooms and concrete cells. The quiet of the morning was suddenly shattered by the low, powerful growl of a high-performance engine. It was a deep, predatory sound that did not belong in this run-down, industrial part of the city. I opened my eyes and looked toward the intersection. A sleek, brand-new sports car, painted a metallic, liquid silver that seemed to repel the rain, was approaching the red light directly in front of my bus stop. The vehicle was a masterpiece of European engineering, its headlights casting a brilliant, blue-white glare through the misty drizzle. As the car came to a smooth, effortless stop at the crosswalk, the driver's side window began to roll down, the glass sliding into the door frame with a soft, mechanical hiss. I stared at the vehicle, my chest tightening with a sudden, instinctive dread that I could not explain. Behind the wheel sat Arthur Pendleton. He looked exactly as he had the night I first met him at the company dinner, pristine, immaculate, and radiating a quiet, untouchable arrogance. He wore a tailored charcoal wool overcoat with a cashmere scarf tucked neatly around his neck, his hands resting casually on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. A massive, gold designer watch glinted on his wrist under the dashboard lights. He did not look like a man who had ever been struck with an aluminum bat or sprayed with capsicum. He looked like a king who had successfully defended his castle and forgotten the peasant who had dared to challenge him. In the passenger seat beside him sat Clara. My breath caught in my throat, and the plastic bag in my hand slipped slightly, the cheap plastic crinkling in the quiet air. She was wearing a beautiful, cream-colored cashmere coat that I had never seen before, her blonde hair styled in soft, perfect waves that framed her face. She looked radiant, her skin glowing in the warm light of the car's interior, completely untouched by the grief, regret, or depression that her sister had claimed was destroying her. She was leaning toward Arthur, her face bright with a genuine, unforced laughter as she listened to something he was saying. She looked younger, happier, and more alive than she ever had during the final years of our marriage. As the laughter subsided, Clara turned her head, her gaze drifting casually out the passenger side window toward the wet, desolate bus stop. For a fraction of a second, her eyes locked onto mine. I stood frozen under the rusted awning, my faded polyester security jacket damp from the rain, my face pale and hollowed by a year of sleepless nights and cheap food. I looked at her, my heart hammering against my ribs with a sudden, violent intensity, waiting for some sign of recognition, some flicker of guilt, shame, or even anger. I wanted to see a tear, a tightening of her jaw, or a look of regret for the 20 years of shared history she had discarded. But there was nothing. Clara's expression did not change. Her eyes remained clear, bright, and utterly devoid of remorse. She looked at me not as her husband of 2 decades, not as the father of her child, and not even as the man she had betrayed. She looked at me with a cold, distant pity, the exact same look of mild discomfort one might give to a homeless man begging for change on a street corner. It was a gaze that stripped me of my humanity, reducing my entire existence to a minor, unpleasant footnote in her grand, luxurious life. She did not blink, she did not gasp, and she did not look away in shame. She simply turned her head back toward Arthur, placing a manicured hand gently on his knee as she said something that made him smile. The traffic light turned green. Arthur stepped on the accelerator, and the powerful engine let out a sharp, aggressive roar. The sports car surged forward into the intersection, its wide rear tires catching the wet asphalt and sending a massive, dirty wave of stagnant gutter water directly toward the bus stop. The freezing, muddy water splashed over my worn leather boots, soaking through the thin fabric of my uniform trousers and leaving a dark, greasy stain across my shins. I stood there in the cold, wet air, the smell of exhaust and dirty rainwater filling my nose, watching the red tail lights of the silver car disappear into the gray, morning mist. I did not scream, I did not cry, and I did not run after them. I simply stared at the empty street, feeling the icy water slowly seep into my socks, a physical confirmation of my absolute defeat. In that quiet, miserable moment, the final illusion of my life was stripped away. I had spent a year believing that my pain was part of a grander, moral narrative, that my suffering was a temporary trial before some form of cosmic justice restored the balance. I had believed that because I was the one who had been wronged, the universe would eventually punish the deceitful and reward the righteous. But as I stood alone in the rain, a convicted felon with empty pockets and a broken heart, I realized the bitter, bleeding truth of the world. The law did not protect the broken, it protected the wealthy who could afford to manipulate its boundaries. The universe did not punish the betrayers, it rewarded the ruthless, the arrogant, and the beautiful, leaving the honest and the wounded to drown in the cold, shallow waters of their own useless justice.